Long ago, in the time of King David, there lived a rich merchant who had a poor servant. The rich man lived in a large house besides a high hill. The poor servant always dreamed of having his own house, his own home, with some land and some cattle. But it was an impossible dream, because he had nothing. He and his wife would think about what it would be like to have their own place, with some land and some cattle. The poor servant worked in the house of the rich merchant. The rich merchant had so much that he was bored by everything in the house. One very cold night he called the servant to bring wood in for the fire, and after he'd stoked it up and got it burning nice and warm, the rich man was sitting there in front of the fire and said idly to the servant, "I wonder how much cold a man could stand." The servant said, "I really don't know." The rich man said, "Yeah, I wonder how much cold. I wonder if we could have a bet. I wonder if a man could, for example," and he looked out the window at the hill. "I wonder if a man could stand at the top of that hill all night, the whole night, sunset to dawn, without clothes, without anything to keep warm with, without even a fire." Again the servant said, "I wouldn't know, but I don't have anything to bet anyway." The rich merchant, being bored, said, "Well, even if you don't have anything to bet with, what is it that you would really like to have if you could bet?" The servant answered, "I always dreamed of having my own house and my own land and some cattle." "Well," said the rich merchant, "I'll tell you what. If you can stand on the top of that hill for a whole night, sunset until dawn, with neither clothes nor fire, then I'll give you your own home and some land and some cattle." The man thought that here was the possibility of him having what he'd always dreamed of. So he said, "I'll go home and talk to my wife about it." So he went home and spoke to her and said, "Do you think it's possible? Do you think a man really could survive at the top of the hill with no clothes and no fire all night?" And she said to him, "You can do it. You can go to the top of the hill and stay for the whole night, because I'll go to the bottom of the hill and I'll build a fire for you, and you'll be able to stand at the top of the hill and look down and see the fire and know that I am keeping it warm for you." So the man went back next day and said to the merchant, "I'll take the challenge. Tonight I'll go up the hill." The rich man was thrilled and sent some of his servants to go with the man to make sure that neither clothes nor fire were involved. So the man climbed the hill, and his wife, as it got dark, went to the bottom of the hill and started to build a fire. The man reached the top of the hill and took off all his clothes. He stood there in the cold, and it got colder and colder and colder. But all the time he could look down and see, twinkling like a star in the darkness, a tiny fire. He knew his wife was there, even though the wind bit into his bones and flesh, and even though the dark was very dark, and even though he thought he was so cold that he'd never ever be warm again, he stayed there with no clothes and no fire. Until finally, when the sun came up, he put his clothes back on and went down the hill to claim his reward. He went to the rich merchant full of joy and said, "I've done it! I've done it! I've stayed the whole night on the hill." The rich man said to the servant, "Did you really stay the whole night?" "Yes, I did. I had no clothes or fire." The rich man said, "That's amazing. How did you do it? You're a very strong fellow." The poor man said, "It was my wife. My wife kept a fire going at the bottom of the hill so I could look down and see it twinkling there like a star in the dark, so I was able to stand the cold." The rich merchant said, "Did you say fire?" "I said no fire. The terms of the bet were no fire, and you have used fire." The poor man was not given the house or the land or the cattle, and he went back to his wife and explained what had happened. She said, "Let's go to King David and take this matter up with him." And so they arrived before King David and explained their story, and King David called the merchant and heard the merchant's story too. And King David, once he'd heard everything, he said, "I find in favour of the merchants because fire was used." The man and his wife left King David's palace very downhearted, with tears streaming down their face. As they were leaving, they met Solomon, King David's son. He said, "What's the matter? Why are you so upset?" They explained the whole story, and Solomon said, "Don't worry, I'll solve this." And Solomon organised a banquet and invited many people. He invited the poor man and his wife and the rich merchant. Evening of the banquet, everyone arrived and took their places, began to talk and chat among themselves, and there was music and there was dancing and storytelling, but there was no food. Time passed and the music kept playing and the stories carried on and people talked amongst themselves, but they began to get a little bit hungry. There was still no sign of any food. People began to say that not to provide any food to eat was very rude. They began to look at one another and whisper, and King David himself was embarrassed. And he said to his son Solomon, "What are you doing? Where's the food?" Solomon said, "Oh, it'll be here in time." But still the evening wore on, and by midnight nothing had been served. King David, finally, in a fury, marched into the kitchen himself to see what was going on. And there he saw, at one end of the kitchen, a fire, and at the other end, the raw lamb. He said to Solomon, "What are you doing? You haven't even cooked the meat." Solomon said to King David, "If the fire at the foot of the hill can warm the man at the top of the hill, then this lamb can easily be cooked by this fire." King David went back into the gathering and called everyone together to have wine. He raised a toast to his only son for teaching him something true of the Lord. And then he called the merchant, the man and his wife, and told the merchant to give them a house, land and cattle. And the man and his wife lived happily ever after in their own home, on their own land, with their own cattle.